Welcome to the Praxology Podcast, where theology fuels the mission of the church. On today's episode, we have a special takeover where our guest will interview us on a topic related to spiritual formation. We're in the middle of winter, so grab that blanket and cup of coffee or tea and settle in for what should be an insightful discussion on formation, potentially some counter-formation principles of formation as well. Bonus points if you can bring those in, Tyler. Probably some formation of children as well because of our guest. I'm Sean Smith, co-host with Tyler Patty. Both of us serve with Josiah Venture in the Czech Republic and teach at Formation College. Special shout out to both of those entities who collaborate with us and allow for this podcast to happen. Absolutely. So Tyler, welcome, and why don't you introduce our guest for us?
Oh, very, very happy to. Thanks, Sean. We have with us the incredible, the amazing, the esteemed Claire Patty, who is my sister. Huge respect for you, not just because you're my sister, but also because of what you do and the kind of person you are and the role that you are. So, Claire, you graduated from Moody Bible Institute with a major in children's ministry. You've worked in lots of different contexts doing children's ministry, which probably a lot of times can be very more pragmatically oriented, can be like be practical maybe. That can be the question like, oh, what do we need to just do to make the kids happy or help the kids take a few steps forward? But you're really good. No? Okay. Well, you're really good at thinking through the deeper questions of formation in children and students. So now you serve with Josiah Venture as the director of the Josiah Venture Kids ministry, which has its kind of eyes on all of the missionary kids and third culture kids and maybe even some first culture kids in the JV network of 16 countries of Central Eastern Europe. So you have a big job, but you have a lot of heart as well and a great mind. So we're really excited to have you on and to hear from you. Claire, what do you love about serving kids?
Oh, I think that kids are the best because they love to play, but they also are surprisingly deep thinkers as well. So I think people underestimate kids and how much they can process. So I love kind of pulling that out and drawing that out of kids and also just playing and laughing as well.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
Oh, very good.
That creativity and bringing that into theological thinking, something we love to do on this podcast. So I think today's going to be a lot of fun. So again, special welcome to you, Claire. And I think officially we can give the idea of this episode to probably you, but Tyler really capitalized on the idea, I think.
Yes.
So we've got basically, I just love the idea of usually a guest comes on and you interview them as co-host, but today we're going to flip that script and Claire's just going to take over and become the Praxology host and essentially interview Tyler and I on a question. We have not been briefed on these questions ahead of time, so this will be very much off the cuff or just whatever comes into our minds. Hopefully it will be a little bit more than just stream of consciousness. So bonus points to us if we can keep it concise, use our sources and actually reference some, and be practical and concrete at points as well.
Those are some good challenges.
I think so, yeah. We'll see. Maybe listeners write us, praxology@formmission.org.uk, and see if you think maybe Tyler or I won.
Ooh, it's a competition. Okay.
It's not really a debate, so there's not really a winner. However, could be a fun twist. So at this point, Claire, we give you the stage. Your questions are related to something specific. So if you want to reference that first in terms of the event that you'll be speaking at soon, and then we can just go right into the questions. So over to you.
Yeah. Well, and this conversation started because I asked you a question in the first place, which is something that I love to do often in general. So I'm so grateful that we can have this conversation officially too, because I love learning from you guys. So, and I enjoy the podcast. Side note. But yes, so I not only serve in international ministry, but I also serve in local ministry with my church. I am the director of our children's ministry at our church. So I lead the team that serves the kids on Sundays and outside of Sundays. And I was invited to speak at a conference in March here in Czech that our church denomination is hosting. And it's a conference for all of the people who serve kids in our denomination. So lots of different churches coming together. Basically, volunteers who serve kids are coming to this conference. And I was kind of asked to be the young voice.
The young expert, more like.
represent the younger people, which is a huge privilege. But also, I feel the weight of that too. So the conference doesn't have a generic theme necessarily, except for how do you work with kids in a church context. But the topic that I was given was how to pass on the faith to children.
Wow.
Which, when I mentioned, this
great topic.
Sean does know, you do know this general topic, and your answer to that question when I first asked it was, do you remember?
I actually don't right now remember.
Your answer was carefully.
Oh yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
You have to do so carefully.
Which makes me want to hear more of what's behind that. But the reason why I wanted to ask you guys this question was because as I think about how to answer this question with all of these volunteers, I want to be thinking holistically, not just about, how do you teach a good lesson, or how do you organize the environment so that it's a good learning environment for the kids, because spiritual formation is so much more than just passing on ideas to their minds. And so kind of my first question is, what framework would you guys approach this from? Would you take it from a biblical framework of saying, hey, let's look at Deuteronomy 6 and let's look at Deuteronomy 11, or, if you want to take the New Testament, 2 Timothy 1, Timothy growing up in kind of a Christian home. Would you take it from that way, or do you have like a broader theological stance that you would take it from? What would be your framework if you were answering this question? What would the framework be that you would take it from?
Summarize the question for us one more time.
Yes. If you were answering the question, how do you pass on faith to kids? What framework would you look at it from, or what lens would you start that conversation by? Because I'm going to be studying this. I'll be preparing for it. So it would be helpful to know, like, here's a path that I would walk down and study more on to prepare for this kind of thing.
I feel like we're doing research for you. I listened to a podcast recently where they had students on to ask questions, and this student was asking questions about Romans 12 because she was writing a paper on it. So this scholar, Michael Gorman, I think it was, is basically helping her write her paper on a podcast.
Amazing.
I think though privilege and priority should go to Tyler, because my answer to that is definitely starting in constructive or systematic theology, and Tyler's is definitely not. So he should start first.
Well, I just first want to say I think this question is really helpful and important, not just in terms of thinking about kids, but also thinking about adults and people in general. So much of our impulse when we think about educating Christians or bringing people up or discipling is focused on, okay, what sorts of things do they need to know? What concepts do they need to have a good grasp on? But with kids, you can't only do that because it's not going to work. They don't have the abilities to think in abstract terms yet, and so you have to be concrete. And so I think actually this is a really great opportunity for us to think, like you said, more holistically about formation, not just of the mind, but of the whole person. So.
Not to mention when you go into concrete thinking versus abstract, it's really easy to get into a moralistic stream. So I would not want that to happen. So how do you get concrete and also do spiritual formation without it becoming moralistic?
Yes.
It's my pet peeve in children's ministry.
Yes, it's definitely the dark side of children's ministry. Every Bible story has a moral. So yeah, the thing that comes to mind for me, I think starting in specific texts is great. But I am thinking more bigger picture, more in terms of the structure of formation that's presented in Scripture, in the Old Testament in particular, because that's where I live.
Come on.
I know, I'm sorry. But I think that the New Testament presupposes a lot of this as well. So the things that I think God gave Israel to form them and form their children to be able to pass it on from generation to generation were a founding story and some founding practices, or some foundational practices. So the founding story, of course, is the story of the Exodus, connected to God's work with the patriarchs as well. It's repeated a lot that the God of your fathers, or our father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's a phrase that's repeated. But in terms of the foundational moment for Israel, it's God's rescue from Egypt, the taking out of the bondage of slavery, bringing them into a promised land, bringing them into relationship with Him. And so much of the Old Testament law and the events go back to that and say, remember what God did. Remember what God did. So the story of God with His people is more foundational than just concepts about like the Bible only rarely, or the Old Testament only rarely tries to describe God. The one exemption, like in terms of His attributes, doesn't use words like omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. It uses relational terms like He's faithful, He is He's patient, he's forgiving. He also doesn't forget to respond to wrongdoing, things like that. And so the story of the people of God transforms the community as they retell it. So I'm thinking if you go back to Deuteronomy, it's when you gather with your children for the feasts, for example, it's an opportunity to retell the stories and to invite the kids to actually ask the questions and to reimagine that story in a fresh way. Then the second thing is foundational practices. There are things that the people of God just do, and that makes them who they are, and that forms them. And I was actually talking to a student of ours down in Albania who is serving in a difficult environment where Albania is historically Christian, but has a long history of Ottoman influence. And so there's a strong Muslim stream in there as well. And he mentioned that he's finding that a lot of young people are actually being drawn or feeling drawn to Islam because there's very clear expectations of how you're supposed to live and what you're supposed to do. This is what it means to be a Muslim. I pray 3 times a day. I say these prayers. I do these things. I'm in this community. I don't eat these things. I do eat these things. And actually, the Old Testament presents something very similar. These kind of founding practices that are just true of what it means to be a part of God's family. So I would say, relating that to educating kids, retelling the gospel, retelling the story of God, not just in terms of abstract principles, but actually telling the story of Jesus, and hopefully the Old Testament as well. But then also giving very practical practices for them to be able to learn what it means to actually live and walk with God. So practices of prayer, practices of confession, practices of fellowship, and a lot of the other kind of spiritual disciplines that we've talked about in the past. So that's my rather elaborate answer, but that's where I would start.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, I'm actually surprising myself because I'm going to start in somewhat of a biblical, theological way. And I've written some thoughts down because that's how I can stay organized, hopefully. But before getting to that, I think you were alluding to something, Tyler, about adult formation and then how that relates to passing it on to children. And I think something that really is important to note is to simply ask, there are many reasons why I think we should ask this question. I'll omit those. But we can ask, how was I formed as an adult? As I was growing up, what elements or experiences did I have that were truly formative? And that then becomes maybe some strengths or positive things that can be passed on. But I think if we ask a second question beyond that, it becomes like, what do I wish would have been passed on to me when I was younger? Mm-hmm. And it would catch some of those negatives of maybe a person's view of, this didn't happen, and because of that, man, I'm just not as better off for it. And maybe coming up with those can have a well-rounded starting point for an adult, a parent, I suppose, especially, to really instill something of value in children. Because if there's, I think I'm trying to say, if we don't have, I can't think of the word, if we don't have like some method or some vision that governs passing things on to kids and specifically how we're going to do that, then it's just going to come across as haphazard, a very scattered approach, and kids will pick up some things. But if there's not structure to the method and they can't see that, then they're not going to catch as many things. They might intake it, but they may not actually embody it and practice it. And I take that from, I'm outside of my realm now in child psychology, of them needing to have lots of structure. Like
it's true. I can confirm that.
Just recently, actually, I think you, Claire, gave my wife a document or something that was on different ways to engage children. And one is that they need specific times of play. And there's like 3 different kinds. One is very active. One's where they're doing something with their hands and motor skills. And those are like natural ways that kids play, and maximizing that becomes important. But I think within each of those, there is that idea of structure.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking through what structure can we do, I think kind of just naturally lends itself to certain aspects of the Christian church, in that some of those liturgical elements or ideas of catechesis, those question and answers that some people shy away from because it's too rote, it's too, you just memorize it, whatever. But those things over the course of time do give a lot of structure to the rest of life, where children like mine often will go, what about this? And they're thinking about the catechism of a sort that we're doing with them, or liturgy that we do. And it becomes a jumping off point to reality. So in that way, the catechism does connect to true reality and become embodied. But again, I think that has to be thought through well from an adult.
Mm-hmm.
Carefully.
So,
Exactly.
so my answer is carefully. And I think also if we can go into some things here. Exodus, Tyler mentioned the Exodus. I'm going to bolster my biblical skills here and go right to the book of Exodus as well.
So impressed with you.
We'll see if it's correct. Here we go. live vetting of ideas here. Exodus chapter 3 to 19 is the official narrative of the Exodus. And Exodus 3 is very much God saying, I'm going to be with you. Interestingly enough, some of that's connected to remembering Abraham. In this case, remember what I promised Abraham? Yeah, I'm going to do that through you. So again, he's forming adult Moses through helping him remember things that God has said and things that God has done. And so I think that is along the way something we can pass along to children by seeing those things ourselves, practicing those things daily. Those are formative practices in and of themselves, I think. Mm. But the end of Exodus is the giving of the law. Exodus 19, the giving of the 10 words. There
Good
we
job.
go.
Good job.
I just got points with Tyler because at one time I learned Hebrew before I forgot it. Greek is my specialty. But Exodus 19 is just 10 words, but the 10 commandments. And those are the culmination of the entire Exodus event. And it's almost as if God is saying, this is your it's theological interpretation here. This is your reward for me bringing you out of Egypt. This is how you can become like me. So we can view those words, perhaps, and Tyler, correct me here, but I think we can view those words as moralistic, like you were saying, Claire, or it becomes possible that those are a broader framework for us to work within in a healthy fashion, for us to truly become like God. I think there are individual and communal elements to that. What do you think, Tyler? Correct? No?
I'll just add really quickly. So Christopher Wright, our beloved favorite missional biblical theologian, he reads Exodus 19 as a gift, as an expression of God's grace.
I'm in good company then.
You're in good company.
I like it.
That not only is God expressed grace in the rescue, he's also expressed grace by being with his people, so like in the present, and he's also expressed grace in actually giving them a clear pathway forward and not making them figure it out on themselves and probably die in the process. Like he's like, no, I'm going to be very clear on what I expect from you and what the pathway forward looks like, and that too is grace. So there you go.
Would you connect spiritual disciplines to that same kind of concept framework of this is actually a grace that God has given us in order to come to know him. And if that's the case, how do you make sure that volunteers communicate that? How can I talk to them in a way that they walk away saying, wow, as we pray or as we memorize scripture or, you know, all of those other things, that we're doing it out of that place of grace and rest and being rescued.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll reference two things biblically, one Luke 2, one Galatians 5 with the fruit of the Spirit, and then you can get in the practical realm there, Tyler, of connecting things. But Luke 2:52, I think, Jesus learned and grew in stature. It might be 42. It's 42 or 52. There's some interesting things there. Jesus is in the Spirit and learning and growing, and there's a lot of weeds you can get into within systematic theology on how that works out. But I think one very high-level thing that can be brought into this discussion from that is that Jesus went to the temple and he subjected himself to advice from others. And so there are, not advice, from good teaching, sound teaching from others, which is a truly humble act just in and of itself. But that might speak to, again, some of that structure that we were just talking about a few minutes ago, of there are times of free play, I suppose, for children, and then times where structure is needed, and maybe not being afraid to have some of those rigid teaching times with children, because those, at least with my own children, I have found can be quite instructive. And then they take those things, and it's kind of fun in their imagination. They end up enacting some of those things in their play, which is really like, it's like their imagination is
because that's how kids
helping them
learn
process.
through play.
Yeah.
It's so true.
And then maybe connecting, if the law, the giving of the law is a gift. I'm reading a text right now from now deceased Hungarian psychologist and theologian, but the book is The Psychology of the Fruit of the Spirit, and he argues that most people view that as the fruit of the Spirit is kind of this ontological status, like it's just stuff that's given to you. But he argues, what if in some aspect we're in Christ, we have every spiritual blessing in Christ, then yeah, that's true, but what if we miss something, that this is kind of like a virtue list, things that, this is a good summary, kind of like the 10 words or 10 commandments of who God is. And beginning to look at those things can help give us framework, because it's not be loving, be joyful. That's weird.
Be more kind to your sibling.
Yeah, but it makes you sort of have to, within looking at that list of the fruit of the Spirit, evaluate yourself and say, how do I do that? Of course, it's in the power of the Spirit. It's the fruit of the Spirit. But maybe some of that stuff can guard against moralistic thought of do this, don't do this. And my goodness, the church has done that for quite a time, and most of the world knows the church for what it's against rather than what it's for. And maybe some of these things brought into the discussion. I don't know. Just some random thoughts.
Fantastic. Well, I want to know how this is, what sorts of connections are happening in Claire's brain, because you're the one with the firsthand experience and the contact with these kids and these ministries and these communities. So, what does this spark? What do our contributions spark in you?
Yeah. What's your guys' tagline? You think biblically and reflect theologically?
Yeah.
Yes.
And act missionally.
And act missionally, yes. So I think if we were going to say, the acting missionally, I think is where maybe the volunteers at this church conference would gravitate towards, is just go straight to that. How are we gonna reach these kids? It's kind of where they would go first. But I appreciate that you both have talked about thinking biblically and reflecting too. And even I'm thinking, I wouldn't have thought of, in this workshop that I have with these volunteers, to give them the chance to reflect on their own experiences and the things that they lacked, and let that fuel their energy moving forward as well. So that's helpful. And then also giving the context for, this is why we tell the stories of God. I think sometimes we can kind of be like, oh, the stories are so simplistic. That's what we do with kids. We tell stories. But to recognize, no, that's because that's how kids are formed, and that's how they were formed all throughout the Old Testament scriptures as well. So both of those things are very helpful.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something there, because oftentimes we do speak of the Bible and we tell stories from it, especially to children, not as much to adults. Interestingly enough, we probably should more than we do.
We should.
Yes. Good dose of narrative theology.
Yes.
Just basically that, I suppose.
Yeah.
More could be said, but focusing upon the giving of story. And, I think it is actually right that sometimes we forget that we're caught up in the story. We just tell the story as this like fact and these ideas in our head, and we forget that our entire bodies are caught up in this story. And if we can do that, there's so much more excitement that we can imbibe and flow into, not just how we like our tone of how we're talking, which I think is probably important for children, and other people to catch that passion and see the desire and see that you're authentic, those types of things.
Yeah.
Which actually kind of plays into the second question that I wanted to ask you guys. So you just kind of handed it to me.
Hey, sweet.
When I was first talking with the leader of this conference, I gave him a bunch of different options of the kind of workshops that I could do. And this one, the how to pass on the faith to the children, had a little tagline to it that I thought would be fun. And I'm curious if you guys, what you guys think of it, and how to connect. Yeah, maybe just in general, how do you take all of these ideas and then think about the kids holistically with their spiritual formation of not just being maybe their minds, but also in community and all those other aspects that you guys have talked about on this podcast. But my tagline was, does God have a sense of humor? And the reason why is because I think a lot of times when we tell the stories of God, when we teach, we take it as this kind of mental exercise or these rules that they should learn and follow, but we miss what you were just talking about of kind of the tone that we say it with. And I recently had a conversation with a kid where I was talking about a funny story in the Bible, and they were so surprised. They were like, "What? There's a funny story in the Bible?" I was like, yeah. I was like, I think God has a sense of humor. And she was just shocked. She's like, no, that's not possible. But it just made me think, what kind of God are we introducing the kids to? And are we giving a holistic picture of him? And then, what that spiritual formation looks like, not just in regards to the way that we teach, but also in the kind of relationships that we have and the tone that we speak in. And maybe you can think of a lot of other categories.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I think that your impulse to put humor as the tagline is a testament to your sensitivity to the cultural context, is where Czechs actually really value humor and cleverness. And so to help uncover some of those aspects of God, I think could be really helpful, and kind of move away from this dry God who just has a bunch of stuff that, he's always very serious. But I think I don't have as much sensitivity for the humor part, but I do think that God is a God of drama. So he's a dramatic God. His ways are not always the straight path. Like, he loves to take wandering detours and go explore and take his people on I think of Job, for example, where he's in this pit of despair, and what does God do? He takes him on a tour of the animal kingdom, and he says, "Look, check out this animal! Look at this! Wow, isn't this amazing?" And it's this journey of imagination and exploration that actually is transformative. So I think that's another element or another aspect that you could bring in to your humor piece.
And to give a resource to that, ironically, you're mentioning a systematic theologian, Kevin Van Hooser.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Drama of Doctrine, some of his other ideas connected to basically the Bible as a grand form of a stage play. And viewing it that way, it actually becomes quite exciting. It can be exciting to view participation and how other elements of that work.
Yeah.
I think go ahead.
just as maybe something that some leaders could kind of sink their teeth in is to help them see some of the figures of speech and some of the storytelling turns and techniques that are common in Scripture. So one that I think is the when a narrative kind of just drops off. Like I think of Jonah at the end, where it just like ends, and you're like, "What the heck just happened?" I also think of the end of Mark. As well, with before the probable addition at the end that kind of softens it out. But it just ends, and we could read that as like, "Oh, they didn't finish it," or we could read it as, "Oh, what would I do next?" Things like that. So
yeah, interestingly connected to that, there's a book, Mark Rhodes, I think. It's called Mark as Story, and he argues basically that Mark was written. Most people say Mark was this dumb guy who wrote with bad Greek and so on, and he argues in this book that the point actually is that it becomes a type of stage play, that it was meant to be acted out for people to see, which is a fascinating idea. Yeah,
that would be cool.
Also, I think for like people who are going to be at this conference, I'm viewing it in a negative way first, and so viewing the negative, it lends to what I think people probably usually say. This would have to be tested across the world. I think people in the United States would do this. In Czech, I don't know as much, but most people's inclination to the answer, does God have a sense of humor? They would tend to answer it with, yes, of course he does. I said I would never do this, and that's exactly what I'm doing now.
Oh, you're right.
Which puts God in a really bad, almost sadistic kind of lens, which is not helpful. And so maybe getting people to see, if that's their inclination, that they have, in a sense, a wrong picture of God, perhaps, that could be challenged, and then they can make sure that they're not passing that on to others. But I think, again, I'm in the Old Testament mood today, Genesis with creation. Just, it comes to mind, does God have a sense of humor? And I go, of course he has to. He delights in the fact that Adam, who knows nothing compared to what God knows, is naming things that God created. I imagine God sitting back and going, "Oh, pig, that's a good one." You know? And anyway.
Oh, it brings to mind all of the silly words that my kids make up, you know, and like, okay, I guess we're going to call it that from now on. But so, yeah, it's in a sense, God models what it's like to, or models for us the kind of approach of drawing somebody with in a childlike state into a process of discovery and wonder in life with him. So,
yeah. Are there any other spiritual formation aspects that should for sure be considered when thinking about formation of kids besides, teaching, and maybe prayer would be the other obvious one? What are some other ones that you would say would be necessary?
For me, the community piece I think is really important. That was kind of implicit in everything I was describing from the Old and New Testament. You aren't formed outside of community. So, and one of the things that's really interesting is that, okay, when you look at Israel and how God presents the idea of passing on the faith, he doesn't tell the Israelites, okay, now you're going to have little pagans that are born into your family, and you gotta make sure you evangelize them, and because they're
nothing but sinners.
They're nothing but little sinners. Exactly. No, he says. He also doesn't assume that they're automatically going to get it, but it's a grace that they are in that community to begin with, and so he gives he almost gives the parents a lot of hope. Like, here's what you can do. And here's the things that you can talk about. And here's when you're sitting, when you're lying down, when you're on the road, here's the kind of things you want to be thinking about. So he doesn't say, "Oh, they're fine, don't worry about it." But he also doesn't say, "Oh, they're just rotten little sinners," until they pray a prayer. But I think also for the New Testament as well, we kind of get hints of that. I can't think of it off the top of my head now, but I'm gonna miss say something, so I'm gonna stop myself. But there, I mean, Timothy's probably a good example of that as well, where it's just kind of like, yeah, of course you would have learned from your grandma and your mom, and of course now you're gonna pass it on as well. So I think that we can have a lot of hope for what God wants to do with children who grow up in believing communities, and we can't discount the power of belonging to a believing community for a child. Mm-hmm. But I didn't answer your question about practices, so now, Sean, you can take it.
Well, maybe restate your question one more time, just so we don't get lost in the middle of your discussion.
Yeah. I mean, what other spiritual formation, maybe practices, if we want to use that, would you say we can't forget about in the conversation about spiritual formation in kids?
Fun. I think
the sacrament of fun.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe not that far. The spiritual practice of having fun.
Yes, I am all for that, Sean.
Clearly this is not a scripted episode. Therefore, I'm just now thinking of this, and I'm reflecting it back on myself and going, how many times do I think rigidly when I'm doing theology, preparing to teach a class or something, and I forget. I was like, I'm passing on this information, and it can then become a different kind of a class if I forget that participating in the life of God, which is
a dance.
Yes. Of a divine three-person Trinity.
Three-person tango.
Yeah. Divine dance, perichoresis is what Tyler's referencing, often called a divine dance. That we are, I have to be careful because I don't necessarily mean what it could mean, that we're caught up in that. Mm-hmm. And that God has, in his wisdom, created things for that to be the case, that we can be in relationship with him. So love, joy, peace, patience, all those things, yes. And we are at the same time becoming like God, which I wonder if that's what Michael Gorman talks about in his text, becoming like God, I think is what it's called. We referenced it last episode nonetheless. But fun, if we infuse fun, it just introduces a lot of different variations of a theme or ways of looking at something that we might miss. Like if I'm really busy on my way to work, I'm not going to look around. I'm just going to come straight to the office. But if I've got more time or I'm in some strange mood, I might look around and actually notice things that I don't usually notice. And usually when I do that, it causes me to reflect and go, oh, God, thank you for that. Because that's really awesome.
Have you ever noticed the paper crane instructions on the windows that you drive by every day?
Where?
Right here in your city.
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
once or twice I've noticed.
Yeah, okay, now that you mentioned that, for sure. Wow.
Speaking of which.
But to connect to what we were talking about before also, the idea of fun, I think, can help us to see positive things of God. Oftentimes we do focus on you're a little sinner. Is this true? Yes, of course. Should we continually be reminded of that? Maybe not, because maybe it produces this negative psychology in us that we forget the good aspects of God, and then we view God as do this or else, and it becomes moralistic. Whereas if we infuse a little bit of fun, then we can start to see some of those positive things and remember that we're made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. And how do we find a balance of that in discussion and talk about that with leaders who are discipling youth? That's a whole nother challenge, I think. Mm-hmm. But
that probably allows for the relationship to be more open and genuine as well. That relational connection to be made for then truths to even be able to be passed on, because it makes the kids feel safe and seen and heard and connected. Yeah?
Yeah, probably.
Great. So. And back to where you kind of started, Sean, thinking about our own formation journey. I don't remember a lot of serious conversations with my dad about God, but I remember the fun. I remember the fun that led to spiritual conversations. The last thing I wanted to say as well is an encouragement to people who work with kids. Childlike faith is the gold standard. That's Jesus's gold standard, the gold star of what faith should look like. That wonder, the complete trust and delight in God and His kingdom. And so we want to cultivate that and not squash it.
So you're saying that as we talk about spiritual formation in kids, we should be recognizing how we're being spiritually formed by them?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's very true.
Yeah.
And also not ignoring that childlike faith involves learning, necessarily so. Children are the most inquisitive. They want to learn and see how the world works. And we shouldn't probably use that verse then as assumed stupidity. Like that's a bad way to say it, but all we need is childlike faith. So I don't need to go on and
Good point.
read my Bible and understand how it works. That theology stuff, that's for experts, and not, maybe not so much. But we only see that different interpretation of a verse if we have a little bit of fun and remember basically how children learn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and in the context of that verse is that the kids were coming to Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to be in His presence. So that childlike faith involves that eagerness to come to Him and be with Him. So
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm dying to ask a question if we've, but I don't know if we're quite ready to flip the script again.
Let's flip it
to where we now.
I want to hear
I
more from Claire.
I can just keep asking you guys questions, but
You can if you want to.
Okay.
You reserve
No,
the right. You're
no,
the host.
You're good.
At
You're
the
good.
moment.
I'm the host.
Yes.
I am giving you the microphone.
Okay. So, there are so many things we can ask, but one I think directly connected. For you growing up, what's one thing that you remember the most in terms of how you were spiritually formed as a child?
Yeah. Well, one of your questions was that you were thinking about when you were thinking about reflecting was, what do you wish you had experienced? And one thing that's been true in my story is that because of the timing of when we were in different churches as a kid, there was never a program that matched my age. And so I actually didn't grow up having a lot of that spiritual formation in my church contexts. So a lot of that happened through relationships in other ways or through sitting in the service with the adults and not understanding the sermon, but wanting to. And I think that although that's not ideal to sit somewhere where you don't understand what's going on, what I am grateful for is that it did kind of pique my curiosity for wanting to be able to understand. And so even as I was sitting in the community of faith, if you want to say that way, even with my dad, who's an excellent Bible teacher and was saying things that were way over my head, being exposed to that actually wasn't a bad thing, because it made me realize that there was so much more that I couldn't even see that was worth being curious about. That's one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah.
That's great.
So being a part of the broader community of faith was formative for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think it probably was for me too. I mean, there was a time where I traded Pokemon cards in the back pew, but that's because I had to be in the service. And so I was hearing what was going on passively.
Yeah.
And I do think actually that did help me as well as I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
I have one more resource I want to plug, but Tyler, what questions are you dying to ask Claire in our final moments?
Oh my goodness. Lots of questions. In your work with third culture kids, what's one thing that is unique about the way that they are formed? Maybe some challenges or some positives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just for context, third culture kids are kids who grow up outside of the culture of their parents' culture. And a necessary aspect of that is that they're accompanying their parents to a culture for the purpose of work or study. So it's kind of this transient life a little bit, which, yeah, your kids are TCKs because they're here in the Czech Republic because of the work and mission that you guys do. So one of the aspects of being a TCK is a high adaptability and mobility, which means that they are really good observers of what's expected of them in various social settings. And sometimes that's exhausting. They spend a lot of energy just trying to figure out what is needed of them. unfortunately, what that can do is in their spiritual formation, they come into a community of faith and they do the same thing. They figure out very quickly what's expected of them, how to act properly, how to talk properly. And they maybe don't feel the freedom to say, oh, that's not me. Or I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know if I want to be that. And so a lot of times that's why TCKs hit a crisis of faith when they go to college, because now they're outside of this bubble that they learned to function in really well a lot of times. And now they're figuring out, oh, okay, what's me and what was me adapting? And so as much as possible with TCKs, it's so important to give them the choice to ask questions and the choice and freedom to disagree about things, even if it's uncomfortable for parents, because it can feel counterproductive. But it's a huge aspect for them to feel that safety to say, hey, what do you think about this? What questions do you have? Are there things that don't make sense? We want to give you an opportunity to think about those things and not just adapt, even though you're really good at that. And I value that. It's a great skill to have, but to give them the safety that they don't always have to use that skill, especially in the spiritual community.
Yeah. Are you talking about more than just, I'm envisioning driving down the road, noticing something weird about the sky's color and asking my children, why do you suppose that God created the sky to be able to look this way, but usually it's blue, and then allow them to have input? Or are you talking, it seems like maybe you're talking about something a little bit more than just that.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more when, like, let's say you have your family, if you want to, like family devos, for example, to you're teaching them certain practices. For example, I know you guys pray together and in your family. So, but I've observed even in your family that you give them the choice of, okay, if you don't want to pray tonight, that's okay. And if you're ready though, here's how you can pray. And so giving them the tools to be able to learn the practices, but also giving them the choice of whether they're ready to do them or not.
I think parents that are listening to this podcast right now are going, oh, I'm affirmed in what I thought maybe was wrong, but this is what I usually do. It's like, okay, if you don't want to pray, sometimes you wonder, like, should like, no, really, you need to pray this time. But giving that freedom, flexibility. Well done, Tyler.
Oh, learning for sure. Oh.
Yeah, but to your question, I actually, one of my favorite games to play with kids is called the I Wonder game, and it's very similar to what you just did, which in your hypothetical situation, what you just did, which was, I wonder why the sky is gray today, and giving them the opportunity to answer that question however they want to. And sometimes I tell them, you can be silly with it. You can say it's because somebody took a paintbrush and decided to paint today, and they mixed all the colors together accidentally, and so that's why it turned gray. Or you can think of something logical that makes sense. But you could even do that with scripture too, and they don't have to have the right answer. You can just say, you can just wonder and think about it, and we can think about it together. And maybe you have an idea. Maybe I have an idea. Let's think about it together. So giving them the freedom to explore, I think, is a huge gift to kids in general, but also to TCKs. Yeah.
There's a fun and a creativity there, but a structure to that.
Yeah. It's a great car game, by the way, too, if you don't have anything to do. The I Wonder game.
Yeah. So one final thing that I'm thinking, reminding myself to be concrete. There's an app that we love to use in our family. We've been using it daily more recently. It's called Lectio for Families.
Yes.
It's an orange app, and it's not the best thing in the world, but it's basically a children-friendly version of a liturgy, and it provides structure, but within that it asks questions of, you read a passage, and then you it thinks of justice, and then the question is, what aspects of God's justice can you participate in, this week? And they're usually more concrete than that.
Yes. Fairly abstract.
Yes. That's just what comes into my head. They're way more concrete than that, and we don't always do those. It's kind of picking and choosing. But that app is really good for giving structure. And one of the things that I have noticed is there's a memory verse that we go through every week, and my wife also pretty faithfully does one with our son on the way back from school or something every week. And just the other day when I was taking him to school, he said, "Can we go over a memory verse?" Oh. And so we're giving some loose structure and having reminding ourselves to have fun and freedom within the Lectio for Family time that we usually do after dinner. And it has started to jump off the page of dry liturgy structure stuff to in real life. He's going, "Oh, what about this? Can we do some verse now?" Or he'll ask questions and so forth. So not to think of my family too highly in what we do, because it's very imperfect. Well, but that app is a good one for helping.
I would imagine while you're doing that practice with the app, it's kind of hard for your kids to sit still. Is that true?
Yes.
So a lot of times parents can be discouraged by that. Like, oh no, I'm doing something wrong, or I need to make them sit still to learn. But your example is exactly what happens while they are experiencing that kind of thing, like a structure. It might not look like they're paying attention, but actually later on is when they process through play or through activity, and that's when all those things end up settling into their hearts. So actually, child psychologists say with that kind of situation, you can let them roll around on the floor. It's okay. Sometimes that's how they learn the best.
Pretending to be a dog. That one happens a lot too.
Yeah. And then, you can ask afterwards you can ask some reflective questions to make sure they weren't just totally in their own world. But sometimes not sitting still is the best way for them to be spiritually formed.
Amazing. Well, our time has quickly drawn to a close. It went very fast. Before I officially wrap us up, Tyler, any final words or just thank yous that you would like to give to Claire?
Thank you, Claire. Thanks for being on here. Thanks for being our first guest host, and asking us great questions, and also having great contributions yourself. So we really hope that the seminar is a blessing for you and for the people that you're speaking to, and we're excited to hear how it goes. Excited to continue these conversations away from the microphones as well.
I'm glad that this podcast was recorded, because I didn't take notes during this, but I'm going to go back and take notes so that then I can use those for preparation for my workshop.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Well, towards that, again, we do thank you, Claire, for doing a pilot for us of guest hosting. If you like that, let us know. We'll do more of this in the future. It's quite fun. And we hope that we've given you the narrow path to preparation for your seminar and have not overly complicated some things. Let us know afterwards what was helpful and maybe what actually wasn't helpful.
Yeah.
We could maybe give that some airtime in the future, because that could be instructive, I think, maybe formative for our listeners as well as us, of what was useful and what wasn't when you were actually giving that seminar. So for our listeners, if you have questions for us or for Claire, write to us, praxology@formission.org.uk, and we'll forward that to Claire, and we'll get those responses to you. We look forward to hearing from you. And also, if you like the variation of our recent episodes, hit that like button, subscribe so that you can stay up to date, and maybe even use it to go back for taking notes like Claire's going to do. We greatly appreciate you joining the Praxology community, where we're working toward theology that fuels the mission of the church. Blessings until next time.
Until next time.